So in the spirit of this gathering, I don't think we have to have Q&A, but we can have observations and counter-observations. But if you also want questions, please. And I should say that one of the ironies of this meeting is that Alan came up to me and said, you know, remember I had a class with you? And I said, I don't think so. And he says, yeah. He says, I was a grad student, but you were doing an undergraduate class in 1972, and I audited as a graduate student. So this has been quite a lesson for me, too, in humility, remembering my own students. Yes?
So thank you for getting us back in the swing of things. I think probably re-energized and things that we sort of had embodied or forgotten. I want to pick up on something that you alluded to and Wally did too, and that's the fact that the papers are here, not at Duke. And on Bob Osborne's critique, which is, as I remember, it was sort of like, was Bill really a colleague? And it's a kind of, I think, Emperor's New Clothes kind of thing to raise that question. But to imagine Bill as a fully formed, grown, mature adult, raising that question in the academy, which ruffled a lot of feathers, Bob Osborne notwithstanding, and then the librarians, is this focusing on this thing? I mean, what's that all about? What do you comment on that further?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to hear Wally comment on my
We had a little bit of discuss of this at Maury's Tavern last night. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Pat who first wrote an email and said that there'd been approached to the Duke Library and it hadn't worked out, and so it was going to come to Yale. I think I first heard about this from Pat Poteat. That's my recollection. And I asked Pat. It wasn't quite the same thing about, oh, we're focusing on business now, you know, business. But it was more a sense that Bill's been out of the Duke loop. I mean, the argument I heard doesn't mean this is the truth, but it's the argument that I heard was Bill had retired in '87, and if you looked at if you just flattened his career and said, okay, you know, what remembered by somebody is what they published, Bill had really published very little by '87, but by the standards of the giant that he is in thinking and rethinking, not just mind, body, but the whole, you know, Cartesian and post-Cartesian legacy, which we're going to explore in the next few days. So I don't think the shadow of the man was cast as large in '87 as it had been by the time of his demise in 2000. So when I read this thing about him saying, I retired for 40 years, and every morning I sit down with my blue book, and I do this hard thinking and writing with the greatest clarity of which I'm capable, I think he really pulled together a lot of things which he only articulated in the classroom or in reviews or in occasional essays, but not in books. And so I think, you know, the librarian says, well, where's the corpus? Where's the there? Which is, again, the irony, the writing. And so I think when, you know, he first retired, there was not this. And then the Department of Religion, as I explained to some people, made a shift with Hans Hillebrand coming back. Some of you may know that name. Hans Hillebrand came back as chair. He was not at all interested in either theology or philosophy. Exactly the turn towards pluralism that Bill decries here sort of became much more of a shibboleth, not just for Duke, but for, by the way, for UNC and also for other religion departments. The end of the Cold War, post-Cold War period, was representationalism. You've got to have representing your department of the traditions. You cannot, in my case, you cannot be a Christian talking about Islam. Oh, really? I've been doing this for 30 years. No, in 1999, I've only been doing it for 20 years. But, you know, I can't talk about it. No, because you're not a Muslim. Oh, really? So there became this whole, and I think I've answered that in various ways, but not to the satisfaction of everyone. But this whole issue of representationalism, you know, takes one to teach one. You have to be a member of religion to be an exponent and certainly a teacher of it. Stanley Hauerwas said, Bruce, you're not a Christian, you're just a Muslim in Christian guise. I said, oh, okay, really? And then he became an Episcopalian. I didn't answer him. I didn't ask him about that. So, you know, but there's a sense in which, you know, you really had to represent who you are in what you taught. And Bill was constantly pushing behind that whole, what he would call another pseudo form of Cartesian logic, which says, you know, if you can't say one-on-one, one Muslim teaches one course on Islam, one Hindu, one Buddhist, and theology and philosophy both were moot. And philosophy itself at Duke, as it has in all, became much more of a mathematical procedure, much more quantitative. Economics, to give an example, another department. The business papers, I can guarantee you the business papers are not the history of economics. It's not the great Keynesian or anti-Keynesian legacy, both of which exist. It's kind of the macro-micro economics model, which now prevails in almost all economics departments. So the Cartesian logic that Bill opposed has become more regnant since his retirement and since his demise. So someone who's looking at this saying, oh, Poteat papers, well, this guy's Plato in the cave. He's an echo, but it's a cave. It's not the modern world. That's my sense of the larger reason. And then, if you want one more pragmatic institutional reason, the other thing happened from '87 to when the whole initiative about acquiring the Poteat papers, either at Duke or, I don't know about Oberlin, but Yale, the Divinity School, which always had a, not exactly an ambiguous, but rather a hierarchical relationship to the religion department, because the Divinity School was really part of the Duke endowment. It was eruditio et religio, didn't mean teaching religion to undergraduates, it meant having training ministers. That's the way it was interpreted by some of the early trustees and also by everybody, almost everybody who's a faculty member of Divinity. Religio is something we teach in Divinity, is something the rest of the university, eruditio, has to learn from us. So that Divinity School model or hegemony, it's both, dominated religion. And Bill was somebody who represented that other minor little footnote called, oh yes, there's religious studies that questions the very categories that you use, from the God word down to the S word, which is sacrament, not the other flatulatory term that Stanley Hauerwas likes to use. So there's a certain sense in which, you know, Bill's work was out of sync with the Divinity School model of what religion ought to be at Duke. And I think it was those two things, the move towards a Cartesian, metrical, numerical way of thinking, but also the dominance of a theological-driven agenda for religion at Duke that made Bill's papers unattractive and unacceptable. That's my thing. Yeah, but do you want to?
I think that's an excellent analogy in terms of theology and versus the professional religion department.
Yeah, and let's just call it phenomenology. Actually, you know, somebody made phenomenology. Bill used to say the theology and phenomenology aren't the same. And, you know, you could explore, that'd be another koan, another kind of thing. But phenomenology was effectively what religious studies departments were about, and I think still are. But go ahead.
You know, I've come here primarily to learn because not having been either a student or a colleague of Bill's, I've already learned a lot. But I'll venture to say that I can imagine anyone in Bill's position that has, you know, I consider his message prophetic in many respects.
Yeah.
Probably developed among a lot of people a sense of his not being part of us, whether they understood what he was saying, in which case they were against him because they knew what he was saying, you know, challenging the dominant theme of positivism.
Yeah.
Or because they didn't understand and therefore were frustrated and, you know, put him in various categories too. Now, to be sure, I do think that Bill was devoted enough to his students that he probably did not have time for some of the, after the departmental meeting, fraternizing in the pub kind of time, be talking to his students. And we all know academic politics. And oftentimes the very slightest kind of unintended act like that can be taken as a shun. And these things build up.
But actually, I just want to add, the friend actually said,
The other thing that grated Bob Osborne, but quite a few other people, is he was so close to the enemy. And the enemy wasn't secularism, it was Carolina.
Yes.
I mean, you know, he taught at UNC that. Rule Tyson, some of you in this room may know Rule. Rule, one of his closest colleagues, collaborators. You know, Rule and he would argue fiercely about things, but they argued as friends. And Bill respected Rule, who was chair. Yeah, Rule was chair at UNC, the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, at the same time as Bill was chair religion at Duke. So there was a lot of soft blue and hard blue, UNC and Duke going on there. And some people said, no, because first of all, there's no divinity school. The divinity school hated UNC because they're teaching religion as if it's a secular discipline, a part of a state university. So there was that. I left that out of my analysis. And Tyson wasn't the only one, but Charles Long, oh gosh. When Charles Long was hired, do you know Charles Houston Long? Wonderful African-American scholar. When Chuck Long, we called him Chuck, when Chuck Long was hired, Bill took the initiative, which I started to say a word with P, but I'll use the word miffed. Miffed a whole bunch of, no, I'm a preacher.
But I mean, a pastor that was part of Poteat's, who loved Poteat.
Okay, I'll give you that.
And I was there from 62 to 66. And I considered a theologian among preachers. No, because he was not preparing it. For me, he was a breath of air, a breath of fresh air, and this kind of thing. But I don't think it would have been true had Cushman remained as the dean of the seminary, because Cushman had a different relationship with Poteat than I think as it came later on. But I think he respected and understood that difference. I remember whenever Dr. Poteat would preach in chapel, he'd always read something. He'd read something from Auden or A.G. Or somebody like that, with profound meaning that you had to really grapple with. Well, this just turned the preacher students off. He was not a theologian, but anybody who ever read A Mother's Tale knows that is major theology. I think that was true. I think you won't find many preachers coming to the Poteat seminar because of this very thing. Now, I do think he was friends with Harmon Smith, who was the ethics professor, and I do think he was friends with Dick Goodwin, who was the pastoral care, and he was friends, they were great, when I was there, with Great Petrie, the great mystic, and Poteat. And those were some conversations that got at this capacity to talk what Poteat was about.
And it's all those people you mentioned are for the divinity school, not for the Department of Religion.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's what this was about.
Yeah.
Whether religion was at odds with it, the divinity school was at odds with it. And for me, he became my father. And I mean, it was even on down, years we used to talk. Every time I got fired,
He was there.
he was there. And I think he's saying something this night, but he was at the heart of a revolution. Now, he was not an activist, but he was at the heart of a revolutionary stance toward preaching and toward religion and toward how you think about religion that kind of set at odds with the church.
Yeah, and with some people in the university as well. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, back there. Yeah.
Two anecdotes.
One is last week, this speaking of the representative partition. I was walking across the college campus and there was a class going on behind the plate glass window. And the instructor had this huge blow up from his computer screen, and all the kids had their little computer screens saying the same thing. I don't know what the course was, but what was displayed across that screen was higher order conditioning. The other goes back a lot of years. There was a time, I'm delighted to see you drawing on Stephen Fulton. And it was a time when I was part of a panel giving a series of talks at a Speech Communication Association convention in Chicago. And Fulton was the respondent. And I frankly forget what my paper was about. I think it was Polanyi, but I think was we went out to a bar and sitting around drinking and talking. And I remember two things he told me. One is he expressed surprise, I wouldn't quite say dismay, but surprise, that his book, The Uses of Argument, had been picked up on so thoroughly by people in the speech community. And it maybe he felt a little embarrassment about that. I don't know. People do feel embarrassment about being around rhetoricians, and I don't blame them. I do myself, and I'm one of them. And he said, you know, I thought that book was, all I was doing was stating the obvious about the infamy from Carson. The other was that as he was staggering out of the bar, he turned to me and he said, well, you had persuaded me that I had more in common with Michael Polanyi than I had thought. And that's the best thing I can say about your paper. And that was the end of my contact with students.
That's pretty good.
My point though, is that we have friends out there. And there are people, there are movements that have things in common with what Polanyi stands for, with what Poteat stands for, that where we deserve to share their strengths and they deserve to share ours. Just
Thank you. Any other comments of people? Yeah. James.
Can you comment on his relationship to Patrick Sullivan, who taught Eastern Europe?
How many you know Pat Sullivan? So actually, Pat
Sullivan's successor, because Sanskrit's one of the languages I learned, and you know, Sullivan was mostly in Eastern religions, otherwise known as Indian. And I've never met Pat Sullivan, but Bill, actually, it was Tom Langford who preceded Bill as chair, said that Pat Sullivan had an admiration for Bill's teaching style, but not for the content of his teaching.
An aberration.
He had admiration for the style, but not the substance of Bill's teaching. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, he really thought he was a great expositor, but it wasn't of the kind of wisdom that was appreciated in India. And I never understood. I never met Pat Sullivan, so I don't know what that, but, so I don't know, and Bill and I talked about a lot of people. We never talked about Pat Sullivan. He always talked about Mac Rickless. Remember Mac Rickless? Matt Rickless was an interpreter and translator of Eliade, the great phenomenologist, mythologist from University of Chicago. Mac Rickless was there at the same time on the Duke faculty in the 60s as Pat Sullivan. So Rickless and Sullivan were there when not Poteat, but Langford was the chair. And they apparently just fought all the time because Rickless really believed, as many people who were Eliade aficionados believe, that he had understood the deep meaning of yoga. The Yoga Sutras of Poteat was Eliade's dissertation, and that was the substance of Indian religion, and Indian religion was the substance of universal religion. So it was a kind of, you know, a kind of ratcheting hierarchy of value, but it all went back to something universal that was above all Indian, above all yoga, and anybody else who did anything else. And I think where Pat Sullivan, what I heard, where he and Bill resonate, at least in their style, is they really forced people to think beyond the text and through the text to sort of larger patterns of argument and possibilities of meaning. So I don't know, that's just a conjecture from what I've heard, and as I said, there was just that one brief anecdote about Sullivan thinking that Bill's style was great, but not his substance. I don't know.
The correspondence that I was just reflecting on was, I think both of them thought that the culture was insane.
Oh yeah, I think they shared that.
And I think that Sullivan maybe had a clearer idea of how history would unfold to demonstrate that. And he called on one lecture I went to. He called on the freshman class to be planetary citizens, you know, citizens not of the world, but of the planet, which I thought was
Kind of, preceding the environmental movement by a few years.
exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, please.
It's not about Sullivan's
No.
talk, but a biographical note, and I'm not absolutely sure of the facts, but he was on my committee.
Pat Sullivan was on your committee?
Yes.
Okay.
And my understanding is that he never went to college, that after high school, or maybe before he finished high school, he left home, got on a freighter, and went to India, put on a robe, shaved his head, and begged, wandered around India.
It was called a bhikkhu.
Having conversations with holy people along the way for something like 10 years, and then came back, and the University of Chicago was the one place where you could get into a PhD program by taking a test, not having to present a degree, and he entered the University of Chicago in that fashion.
Well, we always called him Mr. Sullivan.
I don't remember what we called him, but it's
Yeah.
a very unusual path, I must say.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure, you know, as I said, I never met him. Everything I heard about him, he was what you described as a sannyasin, a guy who, you know, takes the mode of renunciation and then follows it before he deigns to teach. Yeah. And of course, he went to Vassar. So, you know, he ascended to another sphere. So, are there other comments? I just want to thank everybody for having indulged me in this and having the possibility of sharing with you these thoughts and insights about Bill Poteat. I want to just say one last thing, which we haven't really developed, about his relationship with Tom Langford. I mean, I thought somebody might, maybe some of you know more about than I do, but one of the things that was, to me, extraordinary. I agree with what you said about Cushman valuing Bill, but I think also Langford.
Yeah, I didn't know Langford.
Yeah, but Langford, you see, Langford was the one, I think, who really sort of said to Bill, and I'm sure Bill didn't seek it. In fact, I know he didn't seek to become chair of religion, but after Langford, you know, moved to the divinity school and then eventually became provost of Duke, he wanted to make sure that there was a kind of resonant ambiguity, if I can call it that, and not just an explicit hegemony about biblical studies or, God forbid, Christianity in the Department of Religion. So I think that there was a very, very close tie between Langford and Poteat, between Bill and Tom. But this is the sad part. When Tom Langford became dean of the divinity school and then became provost, he had to move more into what I've described in answer to the question about the Poteat papers, more into the one who sort of looked at the whole university and said, where is it going? And just the final thing, what Langford did, which I think probably precipitated Bill's retirement. I don't know this. We never talked about it. Some of you may have a different, but I think what precipitated his, or at least his satisfaction at reaching 40 years and saying, that's it, I'm going to retire in 1987, is that when Tom Langford had been provost in the early 80s, he made a decision which changed Duke forever. He decided that Duke could not compete with Harvard or this place or some place in New Jersey. That instead, it really had to have its own particular ethos, and it had to be mathematical. I never thought of that until just now. It had to be mathematical, and somebody who was both an esteemed mathematician and interested in rhetoric and the humanities. And they picked Phil Griffiths. For those of you who don't know, he was head of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton after Duke, but he was, I've forgotten what he was. He was something at Princeton in the mathematics department, you know, a professor, chaired professor. He was chair. He was chair of mathematics at Princeton and became, after Tom Langford, the provost at Duke. He said, well, gee, that sounds like they've completely sold out to Cartesian logic. So what he did is he went the other way. As a mathematician, he said, Duke can't compete with Harvard or Stanford or, you know, Caltech, any place, or University of Chicago. In terms of sciences, it's got to do something in humanities that makes a difference. And he hired Stanley Fish, and he hired Fred Jameson, and he made, and Franklin Tricchia, a whole galaxy of people who really kind of pushed Duke into this other world of literary criticism, which Bill was opposed to. I mean, it was a kind of, that's my sense that happened. In fact, I remember exactly the year, 1985. It was 1985, he became Tom Langford ceased to be provost in '83, and it took him a year, that is Griffiths, to ratchet it up. But by '85, he had hired both Fish and Jameson and other stars in the literary world, and that changed Duke. Yeah, Betty.
So I just want to comment about Langford and Poteat because your comments just gave me some perspective. I was graduated from UNC Greensboro, and Ben Ladner came to teach there my junior year. So he was my introduction to religious studies. And in floundering about what I was going to do next after finishing my BA degree at UNCG, I decided to explore what the heck was Ladner doing, and of course that meant being pointed towards Duke and Poteat, with no background in traditional religious studies at all. So in the whole process of figuring out where to apply and what to apply, it turns out that the Divinity School was recruiting women. Unbeknownst to me, I didn't know, and I didn't even know what a divinity school was. And they were willing, and I went to interview. Ben said, go talk to Tom Langford about divinity school PhD program. PhD program would have required me to take a lot of basic intro courses that wouldn't count towards my degree, and the divinity school would pay me money to come and take those courses in a degree program. And so my thought was, okay, that's where I'm going. But I went to talk to Langford on Ben's advice, and I went in and said, I don't know if I believe in God, I don't know what a seminary is. He said, that's okay, we like people who ask questions. And I think that was true. And they were recruiting women, I found out later. So which made divinity school a new experience for me, coming from a primarily still women's college. But I think there were maybe a number of women in my class of 20 that were non-traditional students at the divinity school. And subsequent to that, Ellen came from sociology, Pat Lewis Poteat came from a master's degree in English at Kentucky. And at some point, I think there was a category established for special students in the divinity schools whether Langford had a hand in that, but basically all of us, I think he heard of our interest in studying with Poteat and gave us a place of entry in both the divinity school and then headed into the PhD program. So that's my sort of suspicion at this point. I didn't study with Langford in the divinity school. I did begin taking courses with Poteat fairly early on. But there was a place made. And now, nobody at Duke Divinity School would pay me money to go there.
No, they paid money not to go.
Yeah.
I mean, the ethos has really changed significantly. But, thank you.
The one commentary I wanted to have on that, because I started out saying that I've seen some of you at the service. It was actually more a memorial service than a funeral service for Bill at the Duke Chapel back in 2000. But it was really strange because I'd come back from, I'd just been on sabbatical in Tunisia for the spring, but came back in time to do that. But while I was abroad, I missed another major death memorial service, Duke Chapel, in February of 2000, and that was Tom Langford. Yeah. So Tom and Bill died almost within 6 months of each other. And I just thought that, that was a great. Oh, and by the way, the third guy, whom I don't think any of you ever studied with, but he was we all had an office. I should say this is really weird talking about places, because being in this place, I feel like I'm coming back to a place very familiar. But as I got older and was at Duke longer, I used to know that there's one office, 310, that's really prized, because that's where Bill Poteat was after he moved from down and being the chair. And that's also where a guy named Ed Sanders, who's a New Testament scholar, had been. But the other really big person, and I do mean big in every sense, who occupied was C. Eric Lincoln. the pioneering scholar of black sociology, okay? And so C. Eric Lincoln died that June. So, I mean, there were three of them, three giants, all of whom had really been very influential. C. Eric Lincoln, well, that's not true. C. Eric Lincoln was very supportive of my doing Islam and not having to worry about all those other Eastern religions. But he was a really, for those of you who don't know him, extraordinary man. So all three of them had a basic appointment in the Department of Religion, although Langford then went on to the Divinity School. But they all occupied at some point for at least 5 years 310 Gray on the top floor there. So thank you all very much. Glad to be here.